Welcome to the Samuele Tini Show, where business, innovation, and sustainability converge to drive progress. Are you ready to uncover solutions shaping our future? Let's dive in. Welcome to a new episode. Today, we are going to discuss again the world of private equity, supporting SMEs in Africa and the continent in emerging markets, really to deliver into climate change, in delivering solution for the grassroots. And we are here today with the managing partner of Okavango Capital Partners, Josep Oriol. Josep, it's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be.
And Josep, we want to know a bit more about how do you do investment, especially to protect the biodiversity, to support companies that protect climate change and foster sustainability, especially here for us in Africa. But before that and before your work there, we want to know a bit about you. So how is a Catalan come to this side of the world?
Good question. To be honest, my passion for Africa and for conservation started since I can remember. Ever since I can remember, I was obsessed with nature. I wanted to move to Africa. My family doesn't have any connections to the region, but I was badgering them since I can remember, taking them to the zoo, giving them big lectures about wildlife, telling them about different cultures in different countries, from the Maasai to the San or Bushmen, depending on how they prefer to be referred to. There's been a bit of a debate from that in Botswana and the Kalahari. Yeah, just ended up coming here through a very roundabout way. And why is that? Because life gets in the way, of course. And I was gently pushed to get a serious job. Nothing about going around trying to save animals. Ended up training as a lawyer. Part of my family had a law firm. Really became very interested in investments and entrepreneurship. We also had several entrepreneurs in the family, and I then went to business school in the States, to Duke University, did my MBA, and started working in venture capital. That was around the dot-com boom and crash. I learned a lot of lessons out of those two phases of the internet expansion. Ended up working with Santander for a few years, but during all this time growing up and as a young adult, I was very passionate still about nature, still about a lot of interest in Africa. And I started traveling to the region and making friends. And one thing became very obvious to me. I had a moment of realization. It dawned on me that there was a gigantic risk and a gigantic opportunity that was basically built on the huge growth of population and the latent growth that was starting to accelerate of the basic elements of the economy. All the foundational elements in the early 2000s were taking off. Probably the most notable of one was mobile networks, but then sort of on the back of that, access to finance, expansion of agriculture, you name it. At the same time, you had a huge amount of poor people whose only asset was nature. They had the nature they lived in and they had protected for many years, and they needed cash because they were being left behind. They were turning that nature into cash as quickly as they could, and that's normally not very sustainable. And I thought, well, this plan I had of hopefully being successful in venture capital and then maybe buying a small private reserve or being part of something and donating to conservation, there might not be that much to conserve because what we need is to invest in nature, right? The key element of that is that nature is very valuable. We all agree on that, but we're really crap at pricing it. Society historically has been very bad, and you just have to look at what happened in Europe during the Industrial Revolution and the large expansion of population to all our natural assets, right? So we probably need to do something about it, and telling people and pointing your finger at them and lecturing them is not going to help them. They need to put food on the table. They want a better future for their families. Decided to move to the region, gave myself a bit of time, ended up moving much faster. Worked a bit in conservation finance, spent a few years working in more general private equity and venture capital in the region because, well, investing in every region is different. And there is very specific traits about investing in Sub Saharan Africa that I didn't have the experience in. But 2016 I formally started at the end of 2016. 2017, launched Okavango Capital with a couple of partners who had a lot of experience in the region. And we haven't looked back since. Since then, we've put together a bunch of projects and helped invest in companies. And our company today is sort of helping protect probably in the area of 8 to 9 million hectares. So that's, to give you a sense, about twice the size of the country of Switzerland. I mean, obviously, it's the companies that we've invested in. It's not Okavango directly. We've helped sort of hundreds of thousands of rural citizens obtain value from nature, and we've had so far pretty good results.
Fantastic. And this is really the eureka moment, the conservation. Then now you went to and I would like to know more about this case and other. So if you can explain a bit, what is the thesis behind the Okavango? So how do you choose also maybe the investments and the communities? Where do you want to point to?
Well, it's a very good question. Look, our thesis, and that's the beauty of areas that are still relatively new. You don't need rocket science for it. So the investment thesis in terms of how we can create value both for investors and for nature, right? Impact is based on in two elements. One is that premise that nature is valuable. We're just bad at pricing it, right? And it's still going to be the case for a long time. Humans have historically been very bad at pricing public goods, pricing externalities, and nature. The benefits of nature, in the most cases, benefit everyone, but the costs are for the people who have to manage it, right? But we identify businesses where there's a lot of friction with nature. And this idea of friction is that sometimes can be positive, sometimes can be negative. If your business depends on nature, and how you treat nature is going to determine the level of risk you have, the level of profit you have, the branding power you have in the market, your ability to get better margins, your ability to be more resilient, and ultimately, once the financial markets get more sophisticated, the cost of capital of your operations. You are a good target for us, right? The second component is that for us, right, is about business, not about charity, right? There's a huge amount of opportunity for charitable endeavors, for NGOs to back nature, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done with nature that is never going to produce a profit, just like a lot of the work that's being done with education or with healthcare, right? I mean, there's some part where if you're a decent human being, it needs to be out of charitable endeavors. But for what Okavango does, we can have good partnerships. We can use blended finance. We can talk about that later. But the reality, and by blended finance, for anyone who is not familiar, I mean the use of charitable money or grants. But when it comes to our approach, is a business has to be financially sustainable. Our idea is to create role model businesses that can bring examples and can attract more and more capital towards nature positive activities.
And that is very important, because usually, as you said, nature sometimes is the real. Some people also make critique and say, nature, you don't give an economic value. We just want to preserve it and conserve it. Don't touch it and don't move it. But also, we know that it's very easy, maybe said in maybe a European or American city, not at the grassroots level. Can you explain a bit more about how do you see that, and maybe with a practical example of one of the companies or success study that you have done that really puts the value of nature that you want also to and make it sustainable?
Such a good question, and Samuele, I've had this discussion so often, and with people who get very agitated, with passion and good intentions, because they say, you cannot price nature. Nature is sort of so valuable. Putting a price is, demeaning it. And my reply is always, we are putting a price on nature. If I decide to destroy a forest to plant maize, I'm telling you what the price is. It's the future value of the cash flows of that maize and whatever I can get from the wood that I've cut in the form of charcoal or whatever. That's what I'm saying. And that's if the market doesn't react to that or the government doesn't react to that, is that ultimately we're all happy with that price. And that's terrible because at the same time, I'm personally, and I think a lot of other citizens will agree that that's an event of mispricing the asset. We all think the forest is more valuable than that. That's a reality. And every time we make a decision that has economic consequences, we are actually ultimately actively or passively putting a price to it. Examples, well, there are many. I think probably the one of the best examples on that is forest carbon, right? And we've made investments in that space. We have we're small shareholders, but I guess the shareholders of Okavango Capital, through their own vehicles, are the majority shareholders of a really successful and very impactful carbon company called Capital Partners that you've heard about, I'm sure. And it's a company that basically partners with rural citizens in Sub Saharan Africa at the moment, who are stewards of large tracts of wildlife areas and mostly savanna forests, and helps them set up carbon projects, which means using the REDD+ standard, which is reduction from emissions from deforestation and degradation, which basically means you get paid to take care of the forest and not cutting it to do maize and charcoal, which would release massive amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere, make climate change much worse, right? Or emissions from degradation and deforestation would be if there were a country, that would be the third highest emitter in the planet. So they're very serious. And we got involved particularly because of that dynamic of how to put a price on nature in a way that's positive. So when the gentleman who started the company with his business plan came and said, look, we have this business plan, can we start it? And I looked at it and went, well, I don't know much about carbon or climate change, but let me look at it. Let me sort of get a bit more informed. And the bit that really excited me, obviously the climate impact is very important. But what really excited me was, here you go. You have an area where incredibly valuable natural capital, and you have people who are very poor. And by very poor, I mean the average family, we've done the studies, the average family in most of our work areas earns $20 per month. The average family is 6 people, right? That's the cash they have available it's so tragic. They make ends meet by illegal fishing, by some harvesting, by some subsistence agriculture. Is a world you've seen and you're familiar with, but I think for a lot of people who listen to this, sometimes it's easy to think poor is what we think of poor in the rich world. So the idea is that these carbon credits are a way to enable polluters to transfer money for the services that are provided by these rural stakeholders in countries like the ones we work in, like Zambia, Mozambique, etc. And they are creating this benefit for everyone in the planet, including the polluters. But it's a fantastic mechanism to create value, right? And this company, as of today, is actively engaging with almost 1 million people, 300,000 of which sort of have already received payments. The others we still haven't issued, but their projects under development. Sort of close to 7 million hectares under management. I mentioned earlier, almost, that's in partnership with these rural communities in different forms. So protecting massive ecosystems that create gigantic corridors between protected areas for very endangered species, from wild dog to lions, etc. So the benefits for nature and for people are pretty remarkable.
And thank you, Josep. I think it's very important we discuss how would you respond, if I can interject this, to the critic that sometimes, again, coming from the northern hemisphere, not the global south, to the carbon credits, say, and I'm sure you have read the Guardian's articles and others that criticizing the market?
So, I mean, it's very difficult to respond to criticisms that are often very vague. You know, they're always talking about, oh, but there's the level of integrity and the level of benefits and the accountability. You know, some operators have more or less transparency or more or less benefits, and it's hard to say, well, I cannot speak for the whole industry, right? On that front, I cannot say, well, we're incredibly strict and we have all these things. Our companies that we've backed do so, right? And they've gone on to win quite a few prizes. That doesn't mean they're perfect, right? If you run a business, they're going to have problems. One day, one employee will do something wrong if you get big enough, right? I think my main argument is twofold. One is if you look, well, first, carbon credits come from many, many forms. So you could have them from protecting forests, but you could also have them from planting trees around fields and then increasing the soil capture of carbon and protecting your crops, etc. So there are multiple benefits. So from the supply side of carbon, my answer always is compared to other land uses, can you tell me a land use that is more transparent, has more integrity, shares the same percentage of income with rural people in the area, and is willing to put themselves through so much impact measure, right? If you look at basic agriculture, mining, logging, you name it, the typical things you could do with land. Generally speaking, I think this industry is probably head and shoulders above the rest. That doesn't mean, again, they're not going to be cases of problems. Now, when you have a case of problems, do you throw the whole industry out the window, or you do like we've done with banking or with healthcare or with education or with so many institutions where there is a scandal because some boss was harassing an employee or verbally abusive to people, or some investment banker committed fraud, right? You're not going to shut down the bank because there was an investment banking that committed fraud. The legal system has ways to sort this out, and it should be sorted out. And when somebody does something wrong, they should pay for it. I'm not saying impunity is the solution. Now, from the demand side, it's more difficult to argue that the philosophical difference of people saying, well, if you buy carbon credits but you pollute, you're not going to stop polluting, right? But I think that misses the point that the carbon market is so small. It's less than 1%, or the voluntary carbon market, nature-based solutions, less than 1% of total global emissions. And we know, to begin with, two things that are very important. One is of the total emissions, at least 10% and probably up to 20 are never going to be able to be eliminated. You can replace most of your emissions if you switch to clean energy, etc. Start consuming more responsibly, but you're still going to have emissions. Activities create emissions. The second part is there is evidence that most companies that buy carbon credits because they care, particularly in voluntary markets. So if you're spending money because you care, the logic and the data show that you are more likely to be doing something about your actual emissions. So the companies that buy credits are the ones that decarbonize the most. There was an MSCI study that did that. So those are my two arguments. It's an industry that in itself generates the right kind of mindset to address climate.
And another one, I think I would say also is an incentive, to give practical incentives also to avoid and have sentinels on the ground, which otherwise you will not have, especially for critical areas where, the work of NGO and traditional conservation cannot be there, or working together with them. So it is just a part grant support, but also putting also the profit angle to make it more sustainable. And talking about the sectors, from your perspective in private equity and our markets, which are the sectors most investable that you think right now that from here maybe to the 10 years they will be the ones growing?
Another great question. And I think, if you look at natural capital, which is our main focus, right? For us, the key is what businesses are nature positive and are good investment opportunities. So we look at them from three themes. And again, going back to that element of friction, the first one is around the role of agriculture and agroforestry and food production in general. So that includes livestock, rearing, etc. in nature and in economic development, right? It's a Sub-Saharan Africa, particularly, but emerging markets. The agricultural value chain has a very, very large role to play in the economy still. As they transition towards services economies, it's very important that we get this one right? And these are very inefficient systems generally. Agriculture doesn't produce much, but which is surprising in countries like East Africa, where you have often 2 rainy seasons and very fertile soils, etc. But just the choice of crops, the way they're managed, it's still not done at the right level. So there's a lot of opportunity to improve productivity. There's a lot of post-harvest waste, and that's due to a number of things, access to processing, access to markets, storage, you name it. There's a huge risk that's going to get worse, unfortunately, around drought, flood, all climate-related events, right? Poor soil erosion with deforestation means lower yields. So all those things can be improved, right? And that means that the companies that get that right and address all those natural capital and climate risks, right, are going to be much more solid. The second theme that we look at is the use of tech, and most of the tech that we look at has to do with these things, right? How do you manage your soil? How do you manage your post-harvest loss? How do you access markets? How do you reduce risks through things like insurance, through finance, etc.? Obviously, the big elephant in the room is the main driver in deforestation in Sub-Saharan Africa, particularly, is fuel. 90% of the wood that timber that's cut stays domestically, is not to export to other countries like some people would like you believe. Of that, about 90%, so total about over 80% or 1% is used for fuel. If we can replace that, you're replacing a huge amount of problem around climate and around deforestation. And then the third theme is the provision of services, how to monetize the services that come from these very important ecosystems that remain in the world, that are connected, that have huge biodiversity, etc. Right? And there you have, more. I'd say the obvious ones, things like nature-based tourism, but all the payments for ecosystem services include carbon offsets, carbon credits, biodiversity credits. We're very excited about water credits, for instance. As the population grows and becomes more urban, they're going to realize if they want water in the big cities, they better protect the sources of water out in the countryside. So yeah, those are the 3 sectors that we find more exciting, or the 3 themes we find more exciting.
And especially crucial water, because the rate of depletion of the sources and the water catchment areas is of course an alarming rate, even for people sitting here in the mountains area of East Africa. And if you have, let's say, some 3 advice for entrepreneurs, especially in these frontier markets, that you can give from your experience, which one will be?
Probably I need advice as well, but no, I'll think of a couple of things. I'd say one key part for entrepreneurs, and if they're already doing it and they're mature, they know exactly what I'm saying. But if somebody's thinking of starting a company, and that applies to us, we're entrepreneurs as well, right? Okavango is a company like, just with a speciality, is get comfortable with the idea of living under an existential threat, particularly if you work in nature, right? There is every company, even the most successful ones you see in the world, from, I don't know, NVIDIA to Google, they've had moments when they were about to shut down. And it happens. It happens quite quickly. You always have to be ready to work on it. In nature, that's particularly important because first, you're dependent on natural capital if your business is nature, so that's a risk. But also you're dependent on things like, oh, look at that. Some activist organization has decided to write a bad piece about the activities of this company that is generally good, or some journalists wanted to. And suddenly you're in the bucket with the bad guys because what you're doing is not necessarily, it has bad press. So that's a threat. The second bit of advice, a lesson learned, I'd say as an entrepreneur, focus on businesses that have good cash flow cycles and good margins. Because if your business is just, the business model gives you very low margins, it means anytime anything goes wrong, you start making losses and you run out of cash quickly. Conversely, if the cash flow cycle, we looked at a business that we really like, very good entrepreneurs, but the business basically was acting as a bank for both sides of the value chain. They were lending to their suppliers and then getting paid late. So I was like, well, you should do it the other way around. You should have the suppliers give you your supplies and then get paid early, and then you're the one who's receiving free credit, right? So yeah, that's it. That kills a lot of otherwise good businesses. Always focus on having healthy margins and good cash flows. And the third one, and this is very generic, but again, for nature is even more important. Whatever your plan says, expect it's going to take twice the time and 3 times the money you think it's going to take.
And that is an important piece because we discuss in other areas about the role of patient capital. Sometimes, especially in the world of private equity, there is the rush to exit, no, for investors and people. So they want to exit very fast in 5 years, 10x, 5x, and others. Does it work in our markets?
That's such a good question. I'm delighted you ask it. No, it doesn't. In Africa, it doesn't. It happens it can work on cases, but in the generic concept that you can run a fund with 15 investments, making equity bets and get out in 5 years with very high multiples. Look, I like to say that it will happen, or that it probably will happen once the market becomes more efficient and there's more like secondary activity. And by secondaries, financial institutions that buy shares from other financial institutions. Right now, normally you have to sell your businesses to either strategic investors or merge them. Very rarely you list them in the stock market. The listed equity markets are very small. That means most funds take longer in Africa, and the returns therefore get depressed, right? Because it's not only about how many times money you make, it's about how quickly you make that return. So the model has been a bit clunky. There's 2 ways around it. One is just invest with a longer term horizon. We've done that. Are the investments that have gone so well and they are profitable, they've given good returns. They are giving good returns. We haven't exited yet. To be honest, we don't intend to exit because they're very nice investments and they have great stories to tell, and they make us happy every time we go to a board meeting, even when there's problems. But it's also, they took years to get to that level. Some of them don't pay dividends until year 8. So that would be too late for a private equity fund. The second way, and one of the vehicles that we want to raise, is being creative, right? Finance is not just about buying shares. So it's we lend money to companies, and then we have some rights to subscribe some shares over time, which means the company can pay us. We obviously lend the right amount of money, so the company, as they grow, they can repay us or they can refinance. But if then the company gets acquired by a big agricultural group, we can convert and get some more upside. So it's better for our investors, but you don't cripple the company.
A sort of convertible notes or something like that.
Yeah, there's mixes. You can have preference shares, you can have convertible notes. Yeah, you can have warrants. It's all of that financial technicalities.
Yes, that is an interesting thing. And which is the most often seen mistakes that you have seen in your investing career that sometimes company do?
The mistake that I think is most easily avoidable for good entrepreneurs is being too greedy. We've had this discussion, particularly with equity investors, equity investments that we wanted to make, where the companies that do good things have a lot of people wanting to back them. And they start focusing on how much the business is valued, right? There's a valuation 5 million or 10 million or 12. And what happens when you're valued very high is that your investors still need to get a return on investment. They're not there to give money to you just because you're a nice entrepreneur. They have their own investors that want their money back with some returns. And that means if you enter very high, now the pressure is much higher to get very high results. So it creates much more tension. So it's like, I tell them, you're making your life very difficult. Just, I understand people don't want to give their business away, but it's better to just find a formula where they can be realistic about the projection. They don't have to achieve something that is not easily achievable. That's probably the most avoidable mistake that I've seen. Otherwise, I think there's other problems in the region or in general with entrepreneurs. I'd say for capital provision, I would say just make sure that don't go with a guy who gives you the most money, or just make sure that there's a good fit. If you don't see eye to eye about how the business should grow, there's going to be tension over time. There should be a very big alignment of values, particularly. And more so when there's nature involved.
Yeah, and also the time horizon. So the exit is not in 3 years, but between 10, 15. So it's like a marriage in a way. And if I may ask, as a last question for you, how do you see the future of the emerging market? So we know the IMF say the African census and the potential and things. Are we there now that we can see really now is the time also for people to invest in Africa, and the opportunities are here, and we will be really the African century?
Yes, we are there. I just think the problem we have is we anchor ourselves in models that are based on the past, and the future is not going to look like the past. So we think that Africa is going to, if Africa is successful, is going to look like, I don't know, like Italy or like Switzerland. And I always say, if Africa is very, very successful, and I'm using the term Africa in general, any country in Africa is very, very successful, it will look probably more like South Korea or like, Malaysia, or maybe we will have a Singapore in Africa. I hope we do. Countries that will write their own destiny, and they will be slightly different than what development organizations want them to be. And that's fine. Am I excited about the future? Yes. Do I think it's going to be smooth sailing? I don't. It's going to be messy. It's going to be hard. There's going to be a lot of strife. There's going to be political trouble in some countries. But you have a massive change, in a generational change. The generation that's coming now to professional roles and to power are highly, highly educated. They've grown up with the internet. They've traveled. The world is their oyster. They're not intimidated. They know this is their time, and they're super professional. They're very ambitious. It's very exciting. Yeah. So I think there is a lot of opportunity. We just need to get the nature part right, because it's not just countries like Africa or some in Latin America that will suffer, is the whole of humanity. If we get it wrong, we're all screwed.
I think the decision that they are made here, they will influence how we go about the climate change and thing, because that population boom and everything, it will create, if we make the decision correctly, we will have a sustainable development and a win-win for everybody. No, fantastic, Josep. It's been a pleasure and honor having you on the podcast, and thank you so much for sharing your insights.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
Are you satisfied after this wonderful episode? Let's continue together our sustainability journey.